I want secondly to say how very pleased I am to be here in Inishowen, and in particular in the company of the O'Neill family. I was originally supposed to give this lecture last year, but I broke my wrist and I postponed, and I think it's been serendipitous in a way because I understand the O'Neill family weren't here last year, so I think they will be interested. I have never had the pleasure of meeting Tom and Susan before, but I had met Rosemary under circumstances which I'll touch in the last paragraph of my lecture. Now, the key to what I want to say is that the Anglo-American Alliance, what the British like to talk about as their special relationship with America, dictated American policy on Ireland from 1922 until 1977. In essence, the Americans were not prepared to do anything. They were not even prepared to say anything about Ireland or about Northern Ireland, which they thought would upset the British. And the key to that, of course, is we have to recognize that however close the bonds of diaspora, Irish-American friendship, that in the larger scheme of things, international relations and the balance of power, the United Kingdom is much more important than Ireland. And in the First World War, and again in the Second World War, especially in 1940, 1941, when Britain's virtually standing alone in Europe against Hitler, it's the overarching principle of American foreign policy. So that's the basic explanation. From the Paris Peace Conference of 1919, when President Woodrow Wilson resisted Sinn Féin's claim to participate because, as he put it, he would not imperil the work of the entire conference or Anglo-American cooperation in order to force a settlement in Ireland. And that remains true, as I've said, through World War II, and it also, which I'll be speaking about in some detail later on, remains true throughout the Cold War period, the coldest part of the Cold War period. This policy was best summarized by Secretary of State Cordell Hull when he rejected a proposal by the American minister in Ireland that FDR, President Roosevelt, should invite this was just before the Second World War, 1938, should invite the British ambassador in Washington to the White House to discuss Anglo-Irish differences in Northern Ireland. The partition of Ireland, declared Cordell Hull in March 1940, was a matter in which the United States government could not properly participate. And that remained the American point of view. And Tip O'Neill's role in changing that point of view is critical. To do what Cordell Hull described as the minimum towards Ireland remains the recurrent theme of American policy then, until 1977, through the Cold War, and especially, of course, after World War II, Ireland refuses to join NATO, which isn't exactly likely to endear Ireland to the Americans or to the British. Now, Tip O'Neill, as I've said, played a key role in dismantling this policy. His term of office as Speaker of the House of Representatives from 1977 until his retirement in 1986 was bookended by two presidential initiatives that transformed United States policy towards Northern Ireland. The first was President Carter's initiative in August 1977. The second was President Reagan's role in persuading Margaret Thatcher to conclude the Anglo-Irish Agreement of 1985 with the Irish government, and it was that agreement that laid the foundations for the coming of peace in Northern Ireland. Now, the advantages of Ireland's becoming a member of NATO featured in the preliminary discussions of the Washington Working Group, which was drafting the blueprint for what became the North Atlantic Treaty. But the atmosphere changed completely when the then Taoiseach, John A. Costello, announced in the autumn of 1948, he dropped what was in fact a diplomatic bombshell by announcing in Ottawa that Ireland was going to break with the Commonwealth and was going to rename the state. These were the events that the Republic, these were the events that led to the Republic of Ireland Act of 1949 and to the severing of Ireland's last ties with the Commonwealth. So instead, the formula agreed by the Washington Working Group that wrote the North Atlantic Treaty was that Iceland, Norway, Denmark, Ireland, and Portugal should be invited to join the pact if they are willing. But it was also agreed that the Americans would be responsible for extending the invitation. But the British entered a caveat that their government, and I'm quoting from a British document here, would have comments to make on the timing and method of any approach, whether formal or informal, to ERA, which was the term at that point by which the British preferred to describe Ireland. And on 1st of January 1949, a British Cabinet Committee report spelt out the British assessment of the strategic significance of Ireland's breach with the Commonwealth. Now that ERA will shortly cease to owe any allegiance to the Crown, it has become a matter of first-class strategic importance to this country, it's the United Kingdom, that Northern Ireland should continue to form part of His Majesty's dominions. So far as can be foreseen, it will never be to Britain's advantage that Northern Ireland should form part of a territory outside His Majesty's jurisdiction. Indeed, it seems unlikely that Great Britain would ever be able to agree to this, even if the people of Northern Ireland desired it. And what the Americans do follow from that. 3 days after that, the American minister into Dublin is instructed informally to approach the Irish government to ascertain whether they would like a formal invitation to join NATO. But he was told that if they're not interested, if they bring up the issue of partition and the North Atlantic Pact, we won't pursue the matter any further. Some years afterwards, the official in the State Department who drafted these instructions summed up their significance in more blunt and less diplomatic language. We did invite Ireland, he said, to join the North Atlantic Pact as an important stepping stone in anti-submarine warfare. We doubted that they would accept. They replied that they would be delighted to join, provided we could get the British to give them back the 6 northern counties. We simply replied, in effect, it's been nice knowing you, and that was that. And that remained that for the next 30 years. There was no change. I think the best example I've been able to come up with of the extent of the American obsession, and I don't think obsession is too strong a word, that Irish policy, that their Irish policy must never cause British resentment, is best exemplified by their agonizing over whether or not President Truman should send a telegram of congratulations to the President of Ireland on the occasion of the inauguration of the Irish Republic on the 18th of April in 1949, Easter Monday. And Dean Acheson, who even by the standards of the State Department was extraordinarily strong Anglophile, took the remarkable step of asking the American ambassador in London to seek British approval for sending such a telegram. Now, this is the greatest power in the world, let's not forget. The Foreign Office, who were doubtless charmed and reassured by this striking demonstration of American deference to their wishes, responded magnanimously. They had not the slightest objection to the United States government sending such a message, but they would consider it a perfectly normal and neutral act. The important thing was that they'd been asked the question. A review of the world situation prepared by the CIA in April 1949, it was drawing up a balance sheet of the security situation of the United States and of the Soviet Union, spelt out why the Americans were ultimately indifferent to Ireland's joining NATO. The geostrategic reality was that Ireland's participation in NATO was unnecessary because Northern Ireland, as part of the United Kingdom, was in NATO and effectively provided for what the State Department's policy statement in August of 1950 described as the strategic unity of the British Isles. It concluded that Ireland's military potential was by no means an element essential to NATO's success. The denial of Ireland, and this is the key phrase, to enemy forces is already encompassed in existing North Atlantic Treaty commitments. That is taken from a National Security Council position paper, NSC 83-1, which is the key document for an assessment of American strategic interests in Ireland during the Cold War. NSC 83-1, I should perhaps add, had been prompted by the efforts of the Irish Minister for External Affairs, Sean McBride, the highly secret diplomatic efforts of Sean McBride to negotiate a bilateral defence treaty with the United States. It recognised that Ireland could make a valuable contribution to NATO and said its unqualified adherence would be logical and desirable, but the Irish government's refusal to separate adherence to NATO from partition in effect put a price on its adherence and reaffirmed, the position paper reaffirmed, American unwillingness to pay that price. So the conclusions of NS 83-1 were that the United States should first continue its policy of readiness to welcome Ireland as a member of NATO while leaving the initiative to Ireland, and second, should avoid discussion of bilateral arrangements outside NATO. That was adopted by the National Security Council in November 1950, approved by President Truman the following day, and 10 years later, coincidentally, in the same month that John Fitzgerald Kennedy was elected President of the United States, the National Security Council Planning Board reviewed NSC 83-1 and concluded that it remains valid and does not require updating. Now, it may surprise some of you to know that President Kennedy, obviously Irish Catholic descent, hugely popular in Ireland, was not disposed to question this traditional line on Irish policy. What he cared about was his friendship with the British Prime Minister, Harold Macmillan, and he carefully cultivated the special relationship, as I say, notwithstanding his Irish Catholic ancestry. Kennedy, who wrote the Irish ambassador in Washington, was British inclined and makes no secret of his firm attachment to Britain. Now, this is only 3 months before President Kennedy's euphoric visit to Ireland in the summer of 1963. The Irish ambassador also advised that Kennedy would want to avoid raising the subject of partition when Britain has so many pressing problems to resolve. And he advised that Irish ministers should not bring up the subject of partition with Kennedy, and they didn't. Things didn't change under the administration of Lyndon Baines Johnson. The State Department responded to one of the periodic protests from a lobby of Irish American Republicans that a state of occupation existed in Northern Ireland, with arguments that the government of Northern Ireland is a freely elected one, this is the State Department view, which represents the majority's views in a society where the right to dissent is protected by law, that it was not United States policy to intervene in domestic affairs of sovereign states, that the Department of State considered the relations between the British authorities in Northern Ireland to be just such an internal matter, and that they valued the continued use of a naval base in Derry for their security requirements. And these kind of arguments continued to condition American attitudes through the presidency of Richard Nixon. As another Irish ambassador rather painfully discovered when he was paying his farewells in 1973, he made a remark on the closeness of the relationship between Ireland and the United States, notwithstanding Ireland's decision not to join NATO, and this prompted an acid rejoinder from the Secretary of State, which spoke volumes for the enduring American resentment at Irish neutrality. He simply said that in this way, of course, Ireland could enjoy the benefits of the alliance without any of the headaches, which of course was true. Now, the Nixon administration remained essentially unmoved by Irish-American congressional pressure throughout the first and most violent phase of the Northern Ireland crisis from 1969 to 1976. And this is the first time that Tip O'Neill surfaces as expressing a direct interest in Irish affairs. He was then, of course, a congressman. He hadn't yet become speaker. And he sponsored a bipartisan resolution with a Republican congressman, Philip Burton of California, for which they got 102 signatories, a letter to President Nixon protesting against anti-Catholic discrimination in Northern Ireland. Again, the State Department's response was blunt, dismissive. 1, the US has no basis to intervene in internal controversies in other sovereign countries. 2, Northern Ireland is an internally self-governing region of the UK. 3, the problems of Northern Ireland can be best resolved by those directly concerned. 4, Her Majesty's government and the government of Northern Ireland are aware of the concerns of the Americans as expressed by Congressman O'Neill and Burton. Now, in 1969, of course, as I mentioned, the Northern Ireland crisis had erupted. And the Battle of the Bogside in Derry in August 69 starkly exposed the Irish government's inability to counter the special relationship. When Hugh McCann, the Secretary of the Department of External Affairs in Dublin, sought the support of the American ambassador, John Moore, for Irish efforts to inscribe the crisis, the Northern Ireland crisis, on the agenda of the UN Security Council, Moore replied that because of the United States alliances, he was personally sympathetic actually, but because of the United States alliances, the attitude of the State Department would be negative. And because Moore was personally sympathetic, he took the trouble to make a flying visit to the American Embassy in London so that he could telephone the Secretary of State, William Rogers, and another contact of his in the White House. He was completely satisfied that any phone call he made from the embassy in Dublin would be overheard and listened to by the British. Apparently there's a secure room in the American embassy in London where they can't overhear conversations. So he did that, and his analysis proved correct. The State Department reacted as he expected. And again, the State Department's note in response to representations presented by the then Irish Chargé d'Affaires in Washington declared the United States government has, quote, no appropriate basis to intervene with regard to the domestic political situation or civil disturbances in other sovereign countries. They believe the problem can best be resolved by those who are directly concerned. In effect, as the Chargé acknowledged or observed, this accepted, in essence, the British contention that the situation is an internal British matter. And he concluded that the traditional State Department assumption that Ireland by geography and history belongs within the British sphere of influence would take a lot of changing. And that goes on all the way through 1969. Paddy Hillary, the Irish Minister for External Affairs, is going to New York. He addresses the United Nations. He goes to Washington. He had several meetings with Secretary of State Rogers, and despite the ever-escalating crisis in Northern Ireland, he got absolutely nowhere. Resignation. After one meeting with Rogers, Hillary concluded on a note of what one can only describe as resigned pathos. "I have got all from you that I could have asked." And this kind of philosophic resignation characterized Paddy Hillary's brief meeting with Rogers during President Nixon's visit to Ireland a year later. While expressing his government's concern in Northern Ireland, he obviously regarded it as pointless to ask even for minimal American intervention. So marked by this stage was the Irish government's recognition of its impotence in breaking the British stranglehold in Washington, that the then Ambassador William Fay, who was a good friend and played golf regularly with Secretary of State William Rogers, despaired to the point of advising his superiors in Dublin that it would be imprudent to become involved in any congressional activity on this subject. There isn't any change either when we come to the killings in Bloody Sunday on the 30th of January 1972, despite the advice of the American Embassy in Dublin that this Bloody Sunday had raised Irish sensitivities to a very high degree. But again, the embassy in Dublin by this stage is becoming much more sensitive to the attitudes of the Irish government and is advising the State Department that the United States could be forthcoming on this issue on the grounds that the cost to US relations with Ireland of not doing anything considerably outweighed the possibility that US relations with Britain will suffer very much if we approach His Majesty's governments. But again, the State Department rejected this advice. And their advice got short shrift in Washington. And these restrictions upon the Irish government's room for manoeuvre again emerged at a meeting in the White House in October 1972 between Hillary, Irish Minister, by this stage the name of the department's been changed, he's Minister for Foreign Affairs again, and President Nixon. Nixon stressed that the United States was not in a position to openly or publicly intervene in Northern Ireland. Now, I've given this account of the strength of the British stranglehold on the Irish policy of the United States government from 1945 to 76 at some length, because I think it illustrates the magnitude of Tip O'Neill's achievement in persuading Jimmy Carter to drop the hands-off Northern Ireland policy. And Carter was the first Democratic incumbent of the White House since 1969. Now, Tip O'Neill was nothing if not a realist, and he admitted in a confidential note to Carter's new Secretary of State, Cyrus Vance, that it would be simplistic to expect early dramatic developments. He urged that the United States should take whatever helpful initiatives lies within its power. Irish pressure for a relaxation of this hawkish rigidity that had characterized the Cold War began to intensify after a change of government in Dublin in 1973. This has been the first change of government since 1957, and there have been 16 years, continuous years of being fallen apart. And in 1973, Garret Fitzgerald became the Minister for Foreign Affairs. And by that stage, John Hume, the inspirational leader of the SDLP, had already begun successfully ploughing a parallel furrow in Washington, gaining the support of Ted Kennedy for the SDLP Irish government stance against violence in the North. And this assumed added significance after the collapse of the power-sharing experiment, which had been negotiated in Sunningdale. And that collapsed early in 1974. Irish diplomats sent to Washington by the new Minister for Foreign Affairs, notably Michael Lillis and Sean Donlan, brought together as leaders of Irish-American opinion what, as most of you probably know, soon became known as the Four Horsemen, the Horsemen of the Apocalypse. Speaker Tip O'Neill, Senators Ted Kennedy, Pat Moynihan, and the Governor of New York, Hugh Carey. Lillis, press officer at the Irish Consulate in New York, who was promoted to councillor in the Washington Embassy in '76, and Donnellan, then the head of the Anglo-Irish Division of Foreign Affairs, who after Lillis's departure became the Irish ambassador in Washington, began trying to use Washington to persuade the British government to reaffirm their commitment to power sharing in order to strengthen Catholic nationalists and to weaken the IRA. Lillis's strategy was completely to ignore the Anglophile State Department and instead to build close ties with congressional leaders, with the National Security Council, and in particular with Robert Hunter, its director of the National Security Director of Western European Affairs. The NSC had by then acquired the status of a quasi-independent presidential instrument for the direction of American foreign policy. Lillis also became personally very friendly, won the confidence and respect of Tip O'Neill. It was, as I mentioned to Rosemary last night, and she was a bit surprised that I knew about it. It was a friendship which was cemented by regular gifts of Havana cigars from Michael Lillis to Speaker O'Neill, which he could get, despite the embargo with Cuba, he could get through as a diplomat in the United States, in which he would plonk, he would go in and just drop them on the desk and say, enough said. And he welded the Four Horsemen into a kind of club with which to beat NORAID, the Irish Northern Aid Committee, which links to the Provost, and the Irish National Caucus, all supporters of the Provisional IRA. Now, the Four Horsemen began to ride into the ascendant in January 1977, because it was then that Jimmy Carter became president, and it was then that Tip O'Neill became Speaker of the House. Lillis, who had already established this relationship with political leaders on Capitol Hill, a relationship that had no parallel anywhere else in the European community, missions in Washington, laid the groundwork for what became the Carter Initiative. Lillis has recently been well described by Robert Hunter as the Irish Toscanini of an extraordinary orchestra of politicians and officials in Washington. The rest of us, Hunter recently wrote in an email, including the four folks from the apocalypse, just played our instruments when you pointed the baton at us. Tip O'Neill's secretary, Christine Sullivan Daly, has likewise recalled how Lillis led and guided an alliance of politicians, spearheaded by the Four Horsemen, and in particular by Tip O'Neill, with leading Washington journalists and with business leaders in America like Tony O'Reilly and Dan Rooney, all coming together, as she wrote, in the same cause of bringing peace to Northern Ireland. And Garrett Fitzgerald has written in his autobiography, of how Lillis brought the Irish government's contacts with the Irish congressional leadership to a stage of intimacy never hitherto achieved. Now, this was first shown in the Four Horsemen's St. Patrick's Day statement in 1977. Now, St. Patrick's Day 1977 was originally supposed to be the day on which the Carter Initiative was to be announced. But the British still had enough clout in Washington to block that. So it didn't happen at that point. It finally took the form of a 7-paragraph statement on Ireland issued from the White House on the 30th of August 1977. The statement appealed to Irish Americans not to support violence in Ireland. It committed the Carter presidency to the establishment in Northern Ireland of a power-sharing form of government commanding broad support in both communities. It also stated that in the event of a peaceful settlement in Northern Ireland, the United States would be prepared with others to provide aid for investment in new employment. Now, what Carter's statement actually said, because it was very much diluted and watered down because of the diplomatic efforts and campaign of the British, but what it actually said was less important, less significant than what it symbolized. Because, as I've tried to explain, United States government policy had been governed by a principle of absolute non-intervention for 70 years. And President Carter's initiative broke that principle beyond repair and was the important first step in undermining the British government's position, notwithstanding the relatively mild nature, the relatively uncontroversial nature of its content. The Carter Initiative was the first direct presidential expression of a legitimate United States interest in Northern Ireland. It conflicted directly with the wishes of the British Foreign Office and set in motion a bout of international activity which bore fruit ultimately in the Anglo-Irish Agreement of 1985. None understood the significance better than the British, who, as I've said, had thwarted the initial intention of launching the initiative on St. Patrick's Day, and having first tried to discourage any initiative at all, then tried to detach the promise of aid from the search for an acceptable solution. After the election of a Republican president, Ronald Reagan, in November 1980, the American foreign policy establishment reverted to its traditional stance, that it should not anger Great Britain, its closest Cold War ally, and as you know, President Reagan was a great Cold War warrior, and saw Margaret Thatcher as his most important fellow warrior, by meddling in Britain's internal affairs. Because in Britain too, just as with Reagan, political power switched to the right, so it switched to the right in Britain with Thatcher's advent to power. And Tip O'Neill and Ted Kennedy got nowhere when they asked Reagan to press Thatcher to negotiate an end to the hunger strike, in which 10 IRA prisoners died in 1981. Nixon's national security advisor saw little to be gained by such a meeting, and he was much more upset about what he described as the verbal harassment that Irish-American demonstrators are giving British diplomats in the United States. It is intolerable, he wrote, that the representatives of our staunchest ally in the world are subjected to this kind of treatment. And Reagan again rebuffed Tip O'Neill's request to add Ireland to the agenda for a Washington meeting with Thatcher in 1983, and efforts to enlist support for the report of the New Ireland Forum in 1984 also came to nothing. But Tip O'Neill persevered, and thanks to Sean Donnellan, the Irish government had now found another ally, a key player in Irish matters in the Reagan administration. This was the former Californian Supreme Court judge, William Clark, who became National Security Advisor in 1981. Bill Clark was a personal friend of Donnellan, now the Secretary of the Department of Foreign Affairs, and he worked very closely in conjunction with Tip O'Neill to put together a bipartisan approach which would soften the hard pro-British line. Relations between Thatcher and Fitzgerald, Garrett Fitzgerald, who had sunk, by now of course Garrett Fitzgerald is Taoiseach, had sunk to their lowest ebb as a result of her peremptory out dismissal of the three options in the New Ireland Forum report at a press conference after her Chequers summit with Fitzgerald in November '84. But Tip O'Neill succeeded in persuading Reagan to persuade Thatcher that she must soften her stance when they met at Camp David on the 22nd of December 1984, and that was a crucial meeting. Now, Reagan's intervention wasn't altruistic. His administration was in many ways irritated with O'Neill and with the Irish government because of what they regarded as their leftist stance on Nicaragua, and as one National Security Council official put it, they hoped to use it as a lever against Tip to get contra aid moving. But that Camp David discussion was crucial in getting the negotiations back on track. And it culminated in their signing the Anglo-Irish Agreement on the 15th of November 1985, the foundation stone for the coming of peace in Northern Ireland. And after she left office, Margaret Thatcher was asked by a staunch unionist friend of hers, why in heaven's name had she signed the agreement? Her reply was, the Americans made me do it. In fact, at one remove, that was Tip O'Neill. But let me end on a personal note. I had a ringside seat by accident in the summer of 1977 for the Irish-British wrestling match over the Carter Initiative, the diplomatic wrestling match. I first met and had become friendly with Michael Hillis when I took up an appointment as research Fulbright professor at the School of Foreign Service in Georgetown University for 1976-77. And the British rearguard action against the Carter Initiative was so obdurate and so protracted that by the time the statement is actually issued, Michael Hillis is home in Ireland on annual leave with his wife Jane and their children. And when it was published, I was actually house-sitting in his home in Georgetown with Ted Smith, who had been press officer in the Consulate General in New York and who'd come down to cover for Michael during his absence on holiday. Now, it so happened that the subject of my Fulbright research was the Anglo-American Alliance and the Irish question after World War II. So there was a fairly irresistible temptation to offer my own opinion on the historical significance of the Carter Initiative. And I succeeded in having an article accepted for publication on the op-ed page of the Washington Post on the 4th of September 1977. This week, in the course of preparing for this lecture, I fished out from the Washington Post archives a copy of that long-forgotten article. Why I began by asking, did President Carter now step in where his predecessors feared to tread? The decisive factor, I argued, was the sustained congressional pressure led by Tip O'Neill. The policies advocated by the Four Horsemen, at the risk of losing electoral support among those in their constituencies sympathetic to the IRA, had now found formal expression as US government policy. What President Carter's statement might achieve in the short term, I suggested, was difficult to assess. But I also concluded that while no final settlement is in sight, there seems little point in dwelling on such details. For the moment, at least, what the President had said was less significant than the fact that he had spoken. I wrote those words 38 years ago this month. And I hope on the basis of what you've heard this morning, you might agree with me that this appraisal of the significance of the role of Tip O'Neill has stood the test of time. Thank you.
Isolated during those early years and working up then towards a period of involvement, and it all highlighted the absolute magnitude of the achievement of Tip O'Neill, as Ronan has just stated. I'm just thinking there, it was a case of sort of the Four Horsemen up against the Iron Lady. That'd be a picture in my mind of the whole thing. And if you heard the news this morning, you would have heard that President Clinton has actually offered to get involved in the negotiations in Belfast, which is an absolutely amazing thing to happen in view of what our history has been like. So, we'll take a few questions.
Of course,
right? Okay. Anybody has any questions, please? Ronan will take them for you now.
You talk about MSC 83, and then it's updated 10 years later. and you're just about to bring out a book on Dev. Enoch Powell reviewed John Bowman's book on De Valera, in which he said that, in fact, American policy, and this was 1980, I think, American policy was changing towards Northern Ireland because the geostrategic still mattered, that the Americans were very keen to get Ireland into NATO. Now, was this Powell's paranoia, or was there anything behind that? And the second question concerns Margaret Thatcher coming to power in 1979. Because in the Conservative Manifesto, the attitude towards Northern Ireland was one of integration into the rest of the United Kingdom. Yet the first interview she gave was with Johnny Apple in the New York Times, where she did a complete about turn and said that she was going to take a direct interest in Northern Ireland. And both Powell and Mullen suggested that she had come under intense pressure from the United States.
Yeah, well, I think the answer to your first question is, as you've suggested, it was Powell paranoia. There is no evidence that I'm aware of that the Americans ever tried. I mean, their attitude has always been that it would be very nice if Ireland were to join NATO. But they're not going to come cap in hand, and they're certainly not going to do deals about it. So I think that is Powell paranoia. As for your second point, that's interesting. I wouldn't, I think that's a remark with which I'd agree. Thatcher was I've read some memoirs recently of civil servants who were involved on the British side in the negotiations. And Thatcher's attitude to the whole negotiation of the Anglo-Irish Agreement was extraordinarily ambivalent, because she did regard herself as a unionist, and she was shaken to the core of her being, I understand, at Hillsborough. Because it was when just after she'd signed the agreement, she was given a note to say that Ian Gow had resigned. Now, he was subsequently murdered by the IRA. But he was one of her staunchest friends, closest friends, staunchest allies, and a strong unionist. And she felt the accusation that she was betraying the union. She felt that very, very keenly, very, very strongly. And she more or less had to be, it wasn't entirely the Americans, but people like Robert Armstrong, the cabinet secretary, and David Goodall, who was the foreign affairs man in Downing Street and the head of the Joint Intelligence Committee. They played a key role in sort of nudging Thatcher, persuading Thatcher that it was ultimately, that if you wanted to try and get to grips with the IRA, if you wanted to try to prevent the inexorable rise of Sinn Féin and the IRA, then you had to do something to push forward power sharing. What I've always felt about the Anglo-Irish Agreement is that it could be dismantled, and it was, as you know, it was ultimately dismantled. But it could only be dismantled by the people. It's a bit like a circus tent. It can only be taken down by the people who put it up. It can't be overthrown by Paisley and the extreme unionists ranting and raving and roaring, protesting in the streets, the way the Sunningdale Agreement was overthrown.
The question I would have would be, we've heard, I think it's a very, very interesting lecture you gave on that period of our Irish history, but there was one man you didn't mention, and I feel that he might have had a negative effect on all our history, and that was Ian Paisley. Has he come on your radar at all? I know he was there in '74. He took these people out, these 500,000 people out on the streets, and was he just a complete sort of outlier, or was he primed by other forces?
The one positive thing that I think I would say about Paisley is that when he signed up to the agreement and when he goes into a power-sharing executive with Martin McGuinness, the difference between him and Trimble, and this is to Paisley's advantage, I think, was he was prepared to take possession of the agreement. He wasn't, Trimble was always grudging. What Trimble should have said when the Good Friday Agreement was signed, in my view, in order to secure his base, and also because it was true, that in many ways the Union had been copper-fastened. The position of the Unionists in Northern Ireland had been secured. Their position was more secure in many respects. That Sinn Féin, provisional Sinn Féin, were now inside the tent. But he never did that. Trimble could never bring himself to do that. He was always grudging, he was always complaining. And Paisley understood that if you wanted to get credit for something, you had to, if you bought into something, you had to stay bought. And he understood that. For the rest, I mean, I think he's opportunistic, I think he's bigoted, I think he's obviously intensely sectarian, and I think he's responsible indirectly for an awful lot of deaths.
Well, first let me say, as an employee of the State Department for 37 years, I think you described the situation very aptly. I congratulate you and thank you for your presentation. But let me ask you, if I may, if you would dare comment on the current situation and the possibility of there being some way to move the process forward. It seems like it's just absolutely stuck at the moment. That is the positions with the parties.
I really don't know. I find it intensely frustrating, as I'm sure the British and Irish governments and the American government do too, that, every time there's a crisis in Northern Ireland, the people who've been given power, who have power, who are sharing power, the DUP and Sinn Féin, start squealing like stuck pigs looking for help. Help, help. We need British Prime Minister. We need the Irish Taoiseach. We need an American representative. And forgive me if I'm a trifle cynical about President Clinton's intervention this morning, which was reported this morning. I think it might not be entirely disconnected with his wife's campaign to become president of the United States, but I mean, there is no doubt that Clinton could play a role because he's superb at that kind of thing. And he does have special talents in that area. And whether he would enjoy the same degree of trust, I think he might enjoy the same degree of trust from unionists, so he could have a role to play. But ultimately, I think the situation's not going to be resolved until the people who share power in Northern are prepared to take responsibility. And they're not prepared to take. Every time there's a crisis, you can't. Succeeding in government is about managing crises. And they're just not prepared to do it. They're desperately, okay, one can understand why when you look at the past history. But they're extraordinarily immature, politically immature, even now, I think. So I don't know what the way out of it is. But I think it's looking not as bleak as it was 2-3 weeks ago. So, just one thing on your point about the State Department. I was conscious of the fact that you're in this, but I'm glad you don't disagree with me about its Anglophile tendencies. The best example of that I had when Hugh McCann, who subsequently became Secretary of the Department of Foreign Affairs, he was a junior diplomat in Washington in the 50s, and he would keep in touch with the Irish desk officer of the State Department, who was responsible for Ireland. And at that stage, there was a man called Ranney, R-A-N-N-E-Y, F.G. Ranney, I think his name was. And over lunch one day, Ranney confided to Hugh McCann what his favourite reading matter was over lunch every day. Well, I might perhaps, if there's no question, I might perhaps offer one further observation that from my friendship with Michael Hillis, I think this was the occasion when I met Rosemary. Michael Hillis used to throw the most extraordinary parties in his house in Georgetown. And people would spill out from the kitchen into the other room. And that was, I think, where I met Rosemary on one occasion. And that was certainly where I met your father on one occasion. And Ted Kennedy and John Hume singing the town I love so well. The tears were running down his cheeks, and the tears running down everybody else's cheeks. Mind you, there was a certain amount of drink involved. But it was an incredible time. And there was a real sense at that time of history being changed.